Cosplay here, and I'm going to show you how I made my Ariel cloak for my Ariel dress. So I started by measuring the distance around my neck, the circumference, with a little bit of leisure there. On me it was 17.5 inches around. To make my pattern, I used an old duvet cover I don't use anymore, and I measured a 90-degree angle, and then I took my 17.5 inches and I cut that number in half and made a crescent shape towards the middle for my neckline, and then from that line I measured 28 inches all the way around, and then I cut out my pattern. This L shape only makes up for half of the cloak, so once I cut that piece out, I kind of held it up to my back and my front, and I did some waving and some motions just to see how it would sit on me and to see if it was fanned out enough for my liking, which this actually looked perfect. So once I had that right, I decided to cut away a part of the front to round the shape more so you could see more of the details on the front of my dress. For this step, I just used a piece of chalk to kind of mark where I was going, and then I retraced it better on the ground, and then I cut out the piece. So I'm very particular when I cut out my fabric, and I like to lay down 1,000 times to see which way I will end up with the most fabric left over. So I actually do go back and I cut the cloak a little bit more so that I do have that extra fabric left over just for any odds and ends I might want for future projects or add-ons. The idea was to make some gloves and a matching headband for this, which I did make the headband, I just didn't have enough to make 2 gloves with the remaining fabric. One part of the L piece there will be fold lines, so you want to leave it on a fold on the fabric, and then once you unfold it after cutting it, it will be the full piece and there won't be any seams. And for this I needed 2 pieces, that's why I had to rearrange it a few times, because I had to be sure that I would have 2 pieces of this cloak in full without any seams. I matched the 2 pieces together, right sides together, and I sewed around the entire cloak, leaving the neck piece open. This is so I can flip the cape inside out once I'm done. Once the cloak is flipped inside out, you want to pin around the inside edge and then sew that shut as well. Before I did this, I did pin it, but I wanted to try it on the mannequin first to make sure it draped well. Once I was happy with how the 2 pieces fit together, I decided to sew the 2 pieces together around the neckline. Once I sewed that piece together, I decided to fold it in and sew over it again just to hide that little edge seam, and then I do go over it with trim as well, so it does end up looking more finished. Now around the edges you could just buy a fur trim, but I had a lot of white fabric sitting around, so I decided to make little strips of the fur myself. I like this method because you get to decide how thin or thick you want your trim to be. When cutting fur, you want to make sure the fur is facing in the same direction, and you want to cut with a scalpel blade on the back of the fabric, making sure that you press lightly so you don't cut the fur underneath. Once all the fur strips are cut out, I lay the cloak down and I start to pin the fur around the edge of the cloak. I matched the bottom of the fabric for the fur to the cloak so that there was no cloak showing, nor was there any fabric from the fur showing if I lifted the cloak up. I also overlapped the fur strips slightly so there was no gap and they blended together nicely. When sewing it on, I went right around the upper edge with a standard zigzag stitch. I do have a fairly cheap machine, so it does not like going over fur very well. Because of this, I did go a little bit slower just so I made sure to keep all of the hair out of the way of the needle. And because my machine was being so finicky with the first stitch, I decided to glue the very edge of the fur strips to the very bottom edge of the cloak. I used this hot glue gun to glue the edges of the fur strips together as well. I left a little piece of the fur on the edge so I could round it around the corner and glue it down. At this point I put it on the mannequin again just to make sure that it all looked good and there weren't any pieces that I was missing. Next step was adding the trim. Now I'm sure my machine probably could have handled this, but because I had the 2 layers of fleece, the fur, and the trim with the sequins involved, I decided to hot glue it instead of risking the safety of my sewing machine. This way took a little bit longer, but it worked really well. I did, however, get to sew around the neck piece for the trim because that part wasn't as thick without the fur. And that's about it for the Ariel cloak. I do plan to bedazzle it with gemstones in the future, but I think it looks perfect just the way it is for now. I hope you like it!